A little girl asks Barron Trump about God. His response made her cry. The day was warm, and the sun hung lazily in the afternoon sky, casting a golden glow over the park where Barron Trump found himself sitting. He wasn't one for large crowds or public attention, but he enjoyed the peaceful serenity of this particular park. His father, Donald Trump, was busy with some important meetings, and Barron, feeling a little too claustrophobic in the mansion, had taken a quiet stroll to clear his mind. Sitting on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, Barron observed the world around him. The birds chirped in the distance, and the faint laughter of children playing nearby filled the air. It was an ordinary scene, but in some strange way, it was a welcome reprieve from the chaos that usually surrounded his life. As he sat there, lost in thought, a small voice broke through his reverie. "Excuse me, mister?" Barron turned to see a little girl standing in front of him. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Her big, curious blue eyes stared up at him, her small hands fidgeting nervously at her sides. Barron smiled softly, recognizing that she seemed shy but curious. "Yes? Can I help you?" The little girl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I have a question. I hope it's okay to ask you." Barron chuckled lightly, his expression warm. "Of course. What's your question?" The little girl sat down beside him on the bench, her legs dangling off the side. Her dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her hands were folded in her lap. Barron could tell she was thinking carefully about her words. "Do you know about God?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't really understand who he is. My mommy says he's always with me, but sometimes I can't see him. I don't know what he looks like or what he does." Barron's smile faded for a moment, and he shifted slightly on the bench, feeling the weight of her question. He had grown up in a world of complexities, of powerful people with complicated beliefs and ideologies. But this child, with her innocent curiosity, was asking something pure, something simple. It made him pause. He thought about the many times his father had spoken of God, though in a more political context. He'd heard stories of faith, of belief in something greater, but Barron himself had never been quite sure where he stood. There was a part of him that still had many unanswered questions. But here, sitting next to this little girl, he couldn't just ignore her plea for an answer. Barron exhaled slowly and glanced at the little girl's expectant face. She was waiting for him to say something. Anything. "Well," Barron began, his voice softer than usual. "I don't know if I can explain exactly who God is, but I think I can tell you what I believe." The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes, waiting for him to continue. "I think God is more of a feeling than something you can see," Barron continued, his voice calm but thoughtful. "He's like a presence around you. He's in the good things that happen, like when someone helps you when you're sad or when you do something kind for someone else. And he's in the moments when you feel at peace, when you feel safe, or even when you feel love. Those are the times you can feel God, even if you can't see him." The little girl's brow furrowed slightly as she tried to process his words. "But how do you know he's there if you can't see him?" she asked, her voice full of confusion and a touch of frustration. Barron smiled gently, his eyes softening. He could see the earnestness in her face, the genuine desire to understand. "It's kind of like the wind," he said. "You can't see the wind, right? But you can feel it. You can see the leaves move when the wind blows, and you can hear it in the trees. Even though you don't see it, you know it's there because of what it does." The little girl's eyes widened in understanding, and for a moment, Barron could see a spark of clarity in her expression. "I think that's what God is like," Barron continued. "Even if you can't see him, you know he's there because of how he makes you feel. And sometimes, even when you don't feel him right away, you have to believe that he's still there, just like the wind." She nodded slowly, as if the concept was starting to make sense to her. "So, he's like a secret friend?" she asked tentatively. Barron chuckled softly. "Yes, that's a good way to put it. A secret friend who's always with you, no matter what." The little girl sat quietly for a moment, processing the words, and Barron watched her closely. There was a certain innocence in her that made him feel as though the weight of the world had momentarily lifted from his shoulders. She was asking the questions he had never really allowed himself to ask, And in doing so, she was giving him a new perspective on faith, something that had always felt distant to him. After a long pause, the little girl spoke again. "I think I understand. I don't need to see him to know he's real. I can feel him." Barron smiled, his heart swelling with admiration for her clarity. "Exactly." The girl looked up at him, her face full of gratitude. "Thank you, mister," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I feel better now." Barron nodded, his smile warm. "You're welcome. I'm glad I could help." The little girl got up from the bench and started to walk away, but then she turned back around. "Do you think I can talk to God, like, when I'm feeling scared or when I don't understand things?" she asked. Barron paused, his heart touched by her innocence. "Of course," he replied softly. "You can talk to God anytime you want. He's always listening." The girl nodded, her face bright with hope. "But I'm going to talk to him tonight before bed." "Thank you again." With that, she skipped off, disappearing into the distance. Barron watched her for a moment, a sense of warmth filling his chest. Her innocence had reminded him of something important, the importance of faith, of holding on to the belief that even when life was uncertain, there was always something greater than yourself, something that you could trust and turn to in times of need. Barron sat back on the bench, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Maybe he didn't have all the answers when it came to God, but he had learned something important today. Sometimes, faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about believing when you couldn't see the whole picture. It was about trusting that there was something greater than yourself, even when it was difficult to understand. As he sat there in the quiet of the park, Barron smiled to himself. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had made a difference in that little girl's life today, just by sharing his thoughts, his beliefs, and his heart. Barron sat still for a moment, reflecting on the encounter with the little girl. It was strange to him how such an innocent question could stir something within him. She had asked him about God, something that, despite being in his life, had never truly felt like something he understood deeply. His upbringing had been filled with more practical teachings, hard work, politics, public life, but this child had brought him to a deeper understanding of what it meant to have faith, even when it wasn't fully tangible. As he left the park that afternoon, Barron couldn't help but think of the vast questions the world posed, questions about meaning, purpose, and what came next. In his life, he'd often been pushed into a path of success, expectations, and the public eye. But this conversation with the little girl had reminded him of something simpler and purer than any of that: the need for peace, for understanding, and for connection. The next few days passed in a blur of appointments and meetings. Barron was constantly in motion, always on the go, always expected to be in more than one place at a time. His life was full, but there were moments when the noise of it all grew too much. It was in these moments of stillness, during brief pauses in his day, that Barron thought back to the girl's question about God. When his father had spoken about religion in the past, it was always through a lens of politics, never a deeply personal expression. Barron knew that his father's faith was there. He had seen it in moments of triumph and in his quieter reflections, but for Barron, faith had always felt like a side note. He had never truly sought it out for himself until now. There was something powerful about the way the little girl had asked him about God. It wasn't the polished question of a theological student or the skeptical inquiry of an adult. It was a pure, simple question from a child. A question that, somehow, had the power to make Barron rethink everything he thought he knew. The next morning, Barron found himself walking through the halls of the Trump Tower, but his thoughts were still on that encounter. He had a few free hours before his next meeting, so he decided to take a moment for himself and retreat to a quiet space. As he entered his private office, he closed the door behind him, the world outside seeming to fall away for just a little while. Sitting at his desk, Barron took a deep breath, trying to quiet his mind. He didn't know where to begin, but he felt compelled to do something, to explore his own beliefs, to understand more of what the little girl had asked him. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he'd always avoided, his mother's. "Mom," Barron began, his voice cautious. "I've been thinking a lot about something. But I want to talk to you about God." His mother, Ivana Trump, was always supportive, but their conversations about religion had been sparse, as had most conversations about faith. She had raised him with a sense of hard work and duty, but she hadn't imposed any particular religious path upon him. His father had been more open with his beliefs, but it was always in a public context, never something Barron felt he could engage with. "Well, Barron," Ivana replied, her voice warm but curious, "that's a big topic. What made you think about it now?" "I was talking to a little girl in the park," Barron explained, his voice softening. "She asked me about God, and I didn't really know how to answer her. It made me wonder if I've really thought about it for myself. I've heard so much about faith, but I don't really know what I believe." There was a pause on the line, and Barron could hear his mother's thoughtful response. She had always been someone who carefully considered her words, and Barron appreciated that about her. "I think faith is something personal," Ivana said finally. "It's not about having all the answers, but about finding what brings you peace, Barron. It's about understanding that you're never alone, no matter how much you think you are. And sometimes, when life gets tough, it's faith that helps guide you through." Barron leaned back in his chair, digesting his mother's words. It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was a starting point. He knew there was more to explore, and this conversation had opened up something inside him, something that had been buried for too long. Over the next few weeks, Barron began to spend more time reflecting on faith, not through the lens of politics or family expectations, but through his own lens. He started reading about different perspectives, about the ways people throughout history had grappled with the idea of a higher power, the mysteries of life and death, and the meaning of existence. He began meditating each day, taking time to sit quietly, allowing his thoughts to slow down and become less cluttered. Slowly, he began to feel a shift in his perspective. The world seemed a little less overwhelming, the answers a little less important, and the sense of peace, however fleeting, was something he had never truly known before. One day, Barron found himself at an event with his family, a high-profile gala being held at one of the finest venues in the city. It was an evening of socializing and speeches, filled with the usual political figures, celebrities, and business moguls. As he walked into the room, Barron's thoughts were far from the glittering lights and fine suits. He was thinking about the path he had started on, the questions he had started asking himself about faith and meaning. During the event, Barron found a quiet corner, away from the noise of the crowd. He pulled out his phone, intending to catch up on the latest news. But as his eyes glanced over the screen, he found himself thinking back to the little girl in the park, the way she had asked her question with such innocent curiosity. And it hit him again. Her question was still in his heart, still echoing in his mind. As he sat there, trying to make sense of everything, someone suddenly appeared at his side. Barron looked up, startled, to see a familiar face, Tiffany Trump, his sister. She smiled warmly at him, offering him a glass of champagne. "Barron, you okay?" she asked, concern in her eyes. "You look lost in thought." Barron chuckled softly. "Yeah, just thinking." "You're always thinking," Tiffany teased, sitting down beside him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should share his thoughts. But then he realized there was no harm in being open with his sister. "I've been thinking about faith, about what it means. You know, I've never really taken the time to think about it before. But something recently made me wonder, I guess." Tiffany looked at him thoughtfully, nodding. "I think we all go through that at some point. Sometimes it's not about knowing the answers, Barron. It's about being okay with the questions." Barron smiled softly, grateful for her understanding. "Yeah, I guess that's true." The days that followed were filled with more contemplation, but also a sense of peace Barron hadn't felt before. There were still many unanswered questions, but he realized that was part of the journey. The little girl's question had set him on a path of self-discovery, and he was finally beginning to understand what it meant to have faith, not as a political tool, not as something to perform for others, but as something deeply personal, something to give him strength when he needed it most. The future was still uncertain, but Barron now knew that no matter what, he had something inside him, a belief, however undefined, that would guide him through the hardest moments of his life. As Barron continued his journey of reflection, something began to change in him. The questions that had once felt overwhelming were now more like gentle invitations. Each day, as he sat in quiet contemplation, he found that the answers he sought weren't as distant as they had seemed. They were there, waiting patiently for him to discover them at his own pace. It wasn't always easy. There were days when he found himself restless, when the weight of expectations and the hustle of his public life seemed to overshadow his moments of peace. But Barron had learned to recognize those moments for what they were: challenges to his personal growth, reminders that true understanding often came from moments of discomfort. It was a rainy afternoon when Barron found himself once again at the park, the same spot where he had met the little girl weeks ago. The memory of their conversation still lingered in his mind, a seed that had been planted and was now beginning to take root. The park was quieter than usual, the weather keeping most of the visitors indoors. But Barron didn't mind. The solitude was exactly what he needed. As he walked down the familiar path, Barron paused to watch the droplets fall from the trees, creating ripples in the puddles on the ground. The air smelled fresh, and for the first time in a while, Barron felt at peace. His thoughts wandered back to the little girl, and he couldn't help but wonder what had become of her. She had asked him such a simple question, but it had triggered something much deeper in him, a search for something he hadn't even realized was missing. As he stood there, lost in thought, a small voice called out from behind him. "Mister?" Barron turned to see a familiar face. It was the little girl, the same one he had met weeks ago. Her bright eyes were filled with curiosity, and her smile was as wide as ever. "I'm so glad I found you," she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. "I wanted to say thank you for answering my question the other day. It helped me a lot." Barron smiled warmly, his heart touched by her sincerity. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, kneeling down to her level. "How have you been?" "I've been thinking about what you said," the little girl said thoughtfully. "And I talked to God, like you said. It's like He's listening to me, even though I can't see Him. I feel better when I pray, like I'm not alone anymore." Barron felt a lump rise in his throat as he listened to her. She was only a child, but she had understood something profound. Her words mirrored the understanding he had been searching for, something he hadn't even been able to express fully himself. "That's wonderful," Barron said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I'm so proud of you for trusting in that, even when it's hard to see." The little girl nodded, her expression serious. "I don't know everything about God, but I know He's real because I can feel Him when I pray. I think He's always with me, even when I can't see Him." Barron's heart swelled with pride. The innocence in her words reminded him of the simplicity and power of faith. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about feeling the presence of something greater than yourself, even in the smallest of moments. "You've got it," Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly it. Sometimes, the most important things can't be seen, but you can still feel them in your heart." The little girl smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "I'm glad I found you again, mister. Thank you for helping me understand." Barron felt a tear well up in his eye, but he quickly blinked it away. It was strange how a simple conversation with a child could move him so deeply. But in that moment, Barron realized something. He had been looking for answers in the wrong places. The answers weren't in the noise of the world or in the complex ideas of others. They were in the simple truths that came from moments like this. Moments of connection, of sharing, of learning from each other. "You're welcome," Barron said, his voice steady now. "I'm glad we could talk. Remember, you're never alone, okay?" The little girl nodded, her face lighting up with a bright smile. "Okay, I'll always remember." With that, she skipped off down the path, her laughter echoing in the quiet park. Barron watched her go, his heart full. He had learned something invaluable today, something he would carry with him always. The days that followed were marked by a sense of clarity that Barron hadn't felt before. His public appearances, his meetings, and his family obligations all took on a new light. He still had a lot to learn, but he knew he was on the right path. The more he reflected on the conversation with the little girl, the more he realized that the simple things in life, faith, love, kindness, were what truly mattered. It was at the next family gathering that Barron found himself discussing faith with his family, something he had never truly done before. His father, Donald Trump, was in the middle of a conversation with some of his business associates, and Barron felt an unusual pull to join them. "Dad," Barron began, his voice calm but determined. I've been thinking a lot about faith lately. About God, actually. I want to understand it better. The room fell silent for a moment, and Barron could feel all eyes on him. It wasn't often that he brought up topics like this, especially at family gatherings where conversation usually revolved around business and politics. Donald Trump looked at his son, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Well, son, you've always had your own way of thinking about things. Faith can be a personal matter. But I'll tell you this. If you believe in something, you've got to stand by it, no matter what. Barron nodded slowly, processing his father's words. He had always admired his father's confidence, his ability to stand firm in his beliefs. And though their paths to faith might be different, Barron realized that the most important thing was to find something that resonated with him, something that gave him purpose. As the evening wore on, Barron found himself standing on the balcony of their home, gazing out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled below, and the sounds of the city drifted up to him. He was far from perfect, and he didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. His thoughts wandered back to the little girl in the park. She had opened his eyes to something he had never considered before. And as Barron stood there, looking at the vast expanse of the city, he realized that faith was more than just a belief. It was a journey, one that he was ready to continue. In that moment, Barron made a promise to himself. He would continue to seek understanding. He would continue to ask questions. And most importantly, he would continue to believe in the simple truths, in love, in connection, and in the power of faith. Barron stood on the balcony for what seemed like hours, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The cool evening breeze tugged at his jacket, and he could feel the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. His family's legacy, his responsibilities, his personal life, all of it swirled in his mind. But tonight, in the quiet of his thoughts, one thing had become clear. He was beginning to understand what mattered most. As Barron made his way back inside, the sounds of laughter and conversation from the family gathering filled the air. His father was in the midst of a heated discussion with some of his colleagues, gesturing animatedly with his hands as he spoke about his latest business ventures. Barron knew his father's mind was always focused on one thing: success. It was something that had been ingrained in him from a young age. But as Barron stood there, listening to the conversation, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnect. His mind wasn't in the same place as his father's. "Barron, come join us," his father called out, noticing him standing off to the side. "We were just talking about some of my latest projects. You should hear what I've got in the works." Barron smiled and nodded, but he wasn't entirely sure how to engage. The conversation felt foreign to him now. As much as he respected his father's drive and determination, Barron had come to realize that success, as his father defined it, wasn't the only measure of a fulfilling life. There was something more, something that his father often overlooked in the pursuit of power and wealth. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Dad," Barron said, joining the group. "About faith and what really matters." The table fell silent for a moment, and Barron could feel the weight of their attention on him. It wasn't often that Barron spoke out of turn, especially when the conversation was about something so deeply personal. "Faith?" Donald Trump repeated, his voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What do you mean?" Barron took a deep breath. "I've been reflecting on the things that give life meaning. I've realized that success, money, power, they aren't everything. It's about understanding who you are, why you're here, and how you connect with others. And for me, that means understanding faith." His father stared at him for a moment, then laughed lightly. "Well, you've always been a thinker, Barron. But you've got to understand, life isn't just about faith. It's about action. It's about making things happen." Barron nodded, knowing his father's perspective. Donald Trump had always been a man of action, someone who believed that success came from hard work, determination, and a relentless pursuit of goals. But Barron's journey was taking him in a different direction, a path where faith and introspection were just as important as ambition and drive. "I know, Dad. I'm not saying we shouldn't work hard or strive for success. But there's more to life than that." Barron's voice softened, as if he was trying to express something that went beyond mere words. I've realized that understanding who you are and what you believe is just as important as what you achieve. Maybe more. There was a long silence around the table as his family processed his words. Barron knew it wasn't easy for them to hear. His family had always placed a premium on material success, and Barron had never been one to challenge that, until now. Tiffany Trump, his sister, broke the silence. I get what you're saying, Barron. I think we all need something to believe in, something that gives us peace. But for some of us, that belief comes from other places, like family, or our work, or the people we care about. Barron smiled at her. Exactly. And for me, it's about finding peace in what I believe, about faith, about love, about connection. I'm just trying to figure it out, you know? Tiffany gave him a knowing look. I think we all are. His father, though still skeptical, nodded slowly. I get it, Barron. I do. But just make sure you're not losing focus on what matters. Life isn't a dream, it's real. And the world doesn't wait for you to figure things out. Barron appreciated his father's words, though he knew they came from a place of caution, not understanding. Donald Trump had never been one to slow down or pause for reflection. His world was always about the next deal, the next project, the next victory. But for Barron, that world no longer felt like the answer. He needed something more, something deeper. A few days later, Barron found himself at the park again, this time walking alone. The weight of the world still hung on his shoulders, but the park brought him a sense of peace that he couldn't find anywhere else. He sat on the same bench where he had spoken with the little girl, looking out at the trees and the sky. The sounds of the city were distant, and the air was cool against his face. Barron's thoughts drifted back to the conversation with his father. He respected his dad, but he also knew that the life he had built was not one that Barron wanted to follow completely. He had to carve his own path, even if that meant going against the grain. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a voice broke through the quiet. "Excuse me, mister." Barron turned to see a familiar face, the little girl from the park. She was standing in front of him, her bright blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Oh, hello again," Barron said with a smile. "How are you?" The little girl sat down beside him, just like before. "I wanted to thank you again, mister. I talk to God every night, like you said, and he made me feel better." Barron felt a warm smile tug at his lips. "I'm glad to hear that." The little girl looked at him seriously, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about believing in things you can't see. And I think you're right. I believe in God, even though I can't see him. I believe he's real because I can feel him." Barron's heart swelled with emotion. This child, with her simple belief and pure heart, had found the very thing he had been searching for. Faith, not just in God, but in something greater than the self, something that transcended the material world. "You've got it," Barron said softly. "That's the most important thing. Believing even when you can't see. And trusting that what you feel is real." The little girl smiled brightly, her face lighting up with joy. "I'm so glad I met you, mister. You've taught me something important." Barron looked at her, his heart full. She had taught him just as much, if not more, than he had taught her. She had reminded him of the power of simple faith, the kind of faith that transcended all the complexities of the world. As the little girl skipped off into the distance, Barron stayed seated on the bench, his thoughts filled with new clarity. He wasn't sure where his journey would take him next, but he knew one thing. The questions that had once seemed so daunting were now answers that were unfolding before him. He didn't have to have all the answers right away. The important thing was that he was willing to seek them, to ask the questions, and to remain open to the answers, no matter where they came from. As Barron sat on the bench, the afternoon sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the park. The warm hues of the sunset seemed to mirror the growing sense of clarity he was experiencing. There had been so many questions, so much confusion, but now he felt like the fog was lifting. For the first time in a long while, Barron felt like he was starting to understand what it meant to believe, not just in God, but in the unseen forces that guided the world and, more importantly, his life. It wasn't just about the answers, it was about the journey. The little girl had been right. Faith wasn't something that could be explained easily, or something you could fully understand with your mind. It was something that had to be felt, something you had to trust even when you couldn't see it. And in that moment, Barron realized that he had spent so much of his life trying to figure things out with logic, but there were things that couldn't be grasped by logic alone. The next day, Barron found himself standing in his father's office, discussing a new business deal that his father had been working on for months. As Donald Trump detailed the negotiations, Barron's thoughts began to wander. The urgency in his father's voice, the obsession with numbers and power, felt so distant now. Barron tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the lessons he had been learning in the past few weeks. His father noticed his distraction and raised an eyebrow. "Barron, are you even listening?" Barron snapped back to the present, a little startled. "Sorry, dude. Donald Trump gave him a sharp look. "You're acting like you've got bigger things on your mind than this deal. Is there something I should know?" Barron hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to share his thoughts. But his father's sharp gaze made it clear that Barron wouldn't get away with avoiding the question. So, with a sigh, Barron spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About faith, about life, about what really matters." Donald's expression softened, but only slightly. "Faith? Barron, you know we don't have time for that. We've got real work to do." His tone wasn't dismissive, but it was clear that his mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the business at hand. Barron felt a twinge of frustration. It wasn't that he didn't respect his father's drive. He admired it, in fact. But there was something deeper that he was starting to feel, a longing for something more than success, something that couldn't be measured in terms of profit margins and power plays. "I understand that, Dad. But I think I'm starting to realize that there's more to life than just work. It's not all about the next deal or the next big win." Barron's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability there that he rarely allowed himself to show. Donald Trump looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Barron? Are you telling me that you don't want to be part of this family business?" Barron shook his head quickly. "No, that's not it. I think there's more to life than the things we focus on. I want to understand my place in the world, and maybe faith is part of that." There was a long pause. Donald Trump studied his son, trying to make sense of the words he was hearing. "Faith, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself. "Look, Barron, I don't know much about all that. But if you want to find yourself, find it in your work. It's what makes people successful. It's what makes you important." Barron sighed, but he wasn't angry. His father had always defined success by external measures: money, power, fame. But Barron knew that wasn't the whole picture. He could feel it in his heart, like a quiet voice telling him that there was something else to be found. "I'm not saying I'm giving up on work," Barron said, his voice calm but firm. "But I don't want to miss out on something deeper, something that can't be measured by dollars." Donald Trump nodded, clearly not fully understanding, but choosing not to press the matter further. "Well, as long as you're not abandoning the family business, I suppose you can figure out whatever it is you want to figure out. But don't lose focus." Barron gave his father a small smile. "I promise." The next few days were filled with more reflection. Barron had spent so much time trying to live up to the expectations of his family, especially his father, that he had neglected to truly listen to himself. The little girl's words still echoed in his mind. Faith wasn't something you could always see, but it was there, in the way you felt, in the way you treated others, and in the way you carried yourself in the world. It was about trust. Trust in yourself, trust in others, and trust in something greater than you. One evening, Barron decided to take a walk through the city. The sun was setting, and the streets were busy with the usual evening hustle. But as he walked, Barron found that he wasn't really paying attention to the crowds or the noise. His mind was somewhere else, on the ideas that had been growing inside him, on the journey he was beginning to take. He walked past a small church, its doors open to the street. Without thinking, Barron stepped inside. The soft, warm glow of the candles illuminated the quiet space, and the stillness was almost overwhelming. He took a seat in one of the pews, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. For a long time, Barron sat in silence, reflecting on his life, on his faith, and on the things he had yet to understand. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was starting to find the right questions. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, allowing himself to relax into the moment. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet space where he could think and reflect. After what seemed like an eternity, Barron stood up, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He didn't know exactly what his future would look like, but he knew that he was on the right path. Faith, he realized, wasn't just about finding answers. It was about the willingness to ask questions, to stay open to what the world had to offer, and to trust in the process, even when it was unclear. Over the next few months, Barron's journey of self-discovery continued. He still had moments of doubt, still found himself questioning his choices, but he no longer felt lost. With each passing day, he grew more confident in his beliefs and more at peace with who he was becoming. He began to see the world through a new lens, a lens that focused not just on what was visible, but on what was felt, what was believed, and what was trusted. Barron's family, though skeptical at first, began to notice the change in him. He was more grounded, more thoughtful, and more present in the moments that mattered. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to anyone, not even to his father. He was learning to trust in himself and in the things that mattered most. Barron's transformation had started to take root in more ways than he had anticipated. It wasn't just his own internal changes that had become apparent, but the shift in his interactions with others, particularly with his family. The most noticeable change was the peace he had found. For years, he had spent so much time trying to live up to expectations, whether his father's, his mother's, or society's, that he had forgotten to listen to his own heart. Now, for the first time, Barron felt like he was living for himself, not for anyone else. He had become more patient with those around him and more understanding. Where once he might have responded with frustration to his father's business dealings or his mother's concerns, now he took the time to pause, to think, and to respond with compassion. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when old habits crept in, but Barron knew that each step he took on this new path was important. He could feel himself becoming more grounded. One evening, Barron decided to take a different route home. He had finished a long day of meetings and was walking through the park, letting his thoughts wander. The air was crisp, the night sky illuminated with 1,000 twinkling stars. He often came to the park when he wanted to clear his mind, a place where he could think and breathe without the pressure of his family or the weight of his responsibilities. But tonight was different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something was about to change. As Barron walked along the familiar path, he saw someone sitting on a bench in the distance. It was the little girl from the park, the one who had asked him about faith all those weeks ago. She was sitting alone, her legs crossed beneath her, her hands resting in her lap as she stared out at the quiet world around her. For a moment, Barron wondered if he should approach her, if he should say something. But then he realized, as he had so many times before, that sometimes silence was just as important as words. He walked toward the bench and sat down next to her without saying anything. The little girl glanced up, her face lighting up with a smile when she saw him. "Mister, you came back," she said brightly. Barron smiled back, his heart warmed by her genuine joy. "I guess I did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to slow down around them, and Barron felt a sense of tranquility settle over him. He realized that, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," the little girl said, breaking the silence. "About believing in things you can't see. And I think I understand now. I believe in God, even though I can't see Him. I know He's there because I can feel Him in my heart." Barron's heart swelled with pride. Her words echoed the very thoughts he had been grappling with for so long. This child, so young and innocent, had found something that he had spent years searching for. Faith wasn't something you could always see, but it was always there, waiting for you to recognize it. "You're right," Barron said softly. "I'm proud of you for understanding that. Sometimes, it's the things we can't see that matter the most." The little girl nodded, her eyes serious now. "I've been praying a lot. And every time I pray, I feel better, like God is with me. I know He loves me, even if I don't always understand everything." Barron felt a lump in his throat. Her words were simple, yet profound. They spoke of a truth that transcended any complicated theology or philosophy. It was a truth that Barron had only just begun to understand himself. "That's beautiful," Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of you for trusting in that, even when it's hard to see." For a moment, the little girl and Barron sat in silence, watching the world around them. The sound of the leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hum of the city, it all seemed so far away, as if time had slowed down just for them. Barron felt a deep sense of peace in that moment, as if everything was exactly as it should be. Finally, the little girl turned to him with a curious expression. "Mister, what do you believe in?" Barron paused, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't something he had expected to be asked, and yet it felt like the most natural question in the world. What did he believe in? He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I believe in love," he said slowly. "I believe in kindness, in helping others, and in being true to who you are. I believe that there's something bigger than all of us, something that guides us, even when we don't understand it. And I believe in faith, even though it's hard to explain." The little girl nodded thoughtfully, her eyes wide with understanding. "That sounds like a good way to believe." Barron smiled at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. In her simple words, she had helped him clarify something that he had been struggling with for a long time. Faith, he realized, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting, even in the unknown, and finding peace in the things that couldn't be seen. The next day, Barron found himself thinking about his conversation with the little girl long after it had ended. Her words had stayed with him, and he couldn't help but feel that they had sparked something in him. He had spent so much of his life searching for answers that were practical, tangible, and measurable. But now, he realized that the answers he had been seeking weren't always the ones that could be explained with logic. They were the ones that touched the heart, that resonated deep within the soul. Barron decided to take a different approach to life. He didn't want to chase after fleeting successes or meaningless goals anymore. He wanted to focus on the things that mattered most: faith, love, and connection with others. These were the things that gave life true meaning. He began to reach out more, offering kindness and support to those around him, and he found that it brought him a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. It was no longer about impressing people or climbing to the top. It was about living in alignment with his true values and making a positive impact on the lives of others. Days turned into weeks, and Barron's life slowly began to change. His family noticed the shift, though they didn't always understand it. They still saw him as the heir to the family name, someone who would eventually take the reins of the empire. But Barron no longer felt the pressure to live up to those expectations. He was carving his own path, one that was more aligned with his heart and soul than with the legacy that had been laid out for him. One evening, Barron was sitting in his room, reflecting on everything he had learned. It had been a long and difficult journey, but he was beginning to feel at peace with himself. The answers, he realized, were never going to be clear-cut or simple. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the willingness to seek, to trust, and to grow. And as Barron looked out the window at the quiet city below, he knew that he had found something that would stay with him forever: a deep, abiding faith in life, in the people around him, and in himself.